So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ben Green and Scott Fisher. Benjamin Green, MD, became an adult and child psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and has a thriving private practice in Denver. He is also a recent past president of both the Colorado Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Society and the Denver Psychoanalytic Society. Ben is on faculty at both the Denver Institute for Psychoanalysis and the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and has published book chapters and a psychiatric journal article. Scott Fisher, MA, completed his BS and MA at Yale, became an organizational psychologist, and pursued a career as a consultant and executive with rapidly growing companies. He gained in-depth experience in several industries, including natural resources, information services, insurance, healthcare, and nonprofit entities and foundations. Please welcome Ben and Scott.
I want to thank the Society for inviting us to speak here tonight. Larry could not be here tonight, but we've had a number of conversations. Lynn Gillick, who is head of the program committee, helped us shape this up over the last year or so. So it's a great pleasure to be, and it's fun to see all the familiar faces out in the audience. I was charmed by some of the ideas Joseph Campbell wrote about in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Hero is a little bit grandiose. We could have called it Protagonist with a Thousand Faces. But his basic idea was that if you look through the world's religions, myths, literature, almost all of them can be understood as addressing one aspect or another of human development and all the vicissitudes therein. So I thought about that tonight because one of the last stages that Campbell talks about is after the adventurer has gone out into the world and dealt with various monsters and found wise women and men to inspire, instruct, and guide, and finally returns to the village, returns to the tribe, he or she is given the opportunity to share what they have learned on their journey. And so that's sort of how I feel tonight. I'm very glad to not be by myself up here. Scott is a dear friend. We were randomly assigned roommates at college, and we went through the trials and tribulations of being turned down by a wide variety of women. And
speak for yourself.
Criticized and by a variety of professors, but we have stuck together all these years. I actually followed him out here to Denver, and I was very pleased I did. We went through the ups and downs of a marriage and our careers, and got in the habit of having lunch together a couple times a month. And about 6-7 years ago, we began to think about this aging thing. As our 70th birthdays loomed ever larger and closer, we realized this was probably going to be happening, and we better figure out how to deal with it. So that got us started. We did quite a literature review. We actually were disappointed by a lot of the books we read in that they were focused more on the biomedical or epidemiology, and the ones that delved into psychology seemed to do so in a rather facile, superficial sort of way. The people that were most able to speak deeply were therapists, but as we all know, those of us in clinical practice, you're constrained by consideration of patient confidentiality and privacy. So Scott and I asked ourselves, what we could do to see for ourselves what aging was like. There were some honorable exceptions to the rule. Tom Avery and I think Tom's here tonight, we gave several presentations on George Vaillant's book, Aging Well. Vaillant was one of the intellectual disciples of Erik Erikson, and he was the primary investigator for over 30 years at the Grant Harvard study of adult development. So a fascinating study started in the late 30s that included such luminaries as John F. Kennedy and Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. Shamefully, they turned down some very notable people because they weren't athletically built enough. Back then it was thought that that was a necessary prerequisite for success in life. Leonard Bernstein did not shape up, so I guess they missed on that one. But Valiant's book is well worth reading, and we followed some of his guidelines in our study. So what we thought we needed to do was to actually talk with elders. So we chose a sample of 52, and it's quite a diverse sample. We tried to match demographically, socioeconomically, the profiles of Americans 70 and older, so it would be generally a representative sample. And we also just wanted to listen to them. So Scott and I have both been interviewing people for 40 years. Scott was doing so, as you heard, in a corporate context. I did so in a clinical. There's a certain kind of bias, a certain mindset that goes with each of those settings. So we wondered whether things would be the same or look a little different if we just sat down with someone with no particular agenda and asked them to tell us the story of their lives. One of my senior colleagues says, you know, this is going to be more than just a conversation. If you listen patiently, compassionately to people, as we did for 2 hours, there's going to be a real connection there. You know, it may even begin to feel like therapy at some point. And she was absolutely right. And we ended up having conversations with some of these people months or even years later about the experience. So that was an interesting finding in and of itself. But we began the interview just with asking them to tell us their life story. Our basic orientation was quite psychoanalytic. We were listening to not only what they said, but how they said it. We focused a lot on relationship patterns, on how they dealt with the various developmental stages, which we'll get into in just a bit, and also the way the story was told. I've had quite an interest in attachment theory for quite some time, and one of the things that came out of that literature was the notion of narrative coherence. And that is, when you hear people talk about their lives, especially their intimate relationships, it's quite revealing, again, not only what they say, the content, but how they say it. Those people with a secure, autonomous adult attachment can tell the story straight. They can tell it in a candid, open way. They can even interact with someone and maybe consider new ideas, but it's linguistically coherent, organized, the story generally moving chronologically from beginning to end, and you really have the feeling you get to know a person. By contrast, those people with insecure attachments will often try to avoid or disguise or distort or exaggerate or take you on irrelevant digressions. And the language itself is often revealing in that there may be confusion about subject-object agreement, or using the wrong pronouns, or sentences that simply don't make sense and fall apart syntactically. So we try to take account of all that. Our approach was basically intuitive, where most research studies start out with a hypothesis and know in advance what statistical metrics they're going to use to analyze the data. We just wanted to listen and decide for ourselves what sort of patterns were beginning to take shape, what sort of ideas and concepts we wanted to pursue. And so that's what we did. Although we also decided fairly early on, we also wanted to independently score each of these individuals at the end of the interview on 30 variables, and then we compared our scores. The idea was we hoped for some kind of convergent validity. We would hope that there would be some statistical confirmation of our intuitive hunches. So we'll also share that with you today. I would say that Valiant found that 2 of the 7 protective factors were both quite analytically informed. Valiant found that people who had used mature defenses and also those with late life partners, which sounded to us like late life secure attachments, had advantages with regard to both their health and their longevity. So that was the sort of thing we had hoped to discover for ourselves, and we'll kind of let you know how we did with that.
Thanks, Ben. Well, let me just echo what Ben said. It's lovely to be here with you. Not being a clinical person or clinically trained, I'm feeling a little intimidated. But you're going to learn quickly that I'm sort of the 10,000-foot concept guy, and I leave all the minutia and all the details to Ben, who loves to go down analytic rabbit holes. And if you want to follow him down there, let's have some fun tonight. I need to go back to the origin of the Aging Wisely project just briefly. It's important that you understand that Ben and I didn't have big expectations about this project. We had this tradition of having lunch together once or twice a week and supporting each other in life's challenges. And for me, it was a very inexpensive form of therapy that helped me a lot over the years. And so we get to our late 60s and we say, well, Ben said, I think, we ought to do a project together. We've never worked on something together. And after a few more months of lunches, we said, well, how about let's figure out how to get old successfully. And that started us down this literature search, and then realizing we need to go talk to some old people. Now we talked to people, as Ben said, 52 elders between the ages of 70 and 95. And it turned out, as we realized that we were learning some things that wasn't in the literature, we realized we had to put a good sample together. And so we did cobble together, one way or another, a pretty representative sample of what the over 65 population is in the United States. And because we were 2 old guys with a very limited budget, we didn't have time for anything like the Harvard study on aging. You know, we couldn't follow people for decades. So for us, listening to people's life stories turned out to be just a wonderful fountain of wisdom. So I guess I want you to know that this Aging Wisely project really operates on 3 levels. It's the story of Ben and I meandering down this road, sort of evolving a project that ended up in a book, but we had no expectations that would ever happen. So in that sense, we weren't scientific researchers, but we just kept pulling things together. And then we realized we had this wealth of information. So it's a story of what we learned together, which has been a life-changing experience for me. It was the stories of our 52 elders who, whether their lives were successful or their lives got to really tragic places, it was amazing to sit with people in a non-judgmental room and just say, tell us your story. And we made sure that we went down appropriate rabbit holes and digressions. We asked them follow-up questions. And I can't tell you the number of people who at the end of the interview looked at us and said, thank you. You know, nobody's ever asked me to tell them my story. And I learned things about myself that I never knew before. And we've had a couple people say, now several years later, that it's really transformed their lives and set their life trajectory, the arc of their life, on a different path, and a positive path. So let's move on here a little bit to just give you a notion of where we were coming from during this several-year project of interviewing people. Clearly, we're living longer and healthier lifespans, okay? If you're a person today in relatively good health in your early 70s, the actuarial tables say you've got 15 to 20 years on average. What are you going to do with that? I don't know about you folks, but my parents and my grandparents, they sort of worked as long as they could work. They hoped to pull together enough money to last them the rest of their life, but the rest of their life didn't last that long. So they spent as much of their time as they could with family and grandchildren, and then they got sick and died. And now we can look forward, many of us, many more of us, to living well into our 90s. And so Ben and I, using Erickson's developmental stages as a model, really felt like there was another developmental stage here that Erickson and his wife Joan alluded to in their last co-authored book, but it was very conceptual, and we said, what if we could bring enough structure to this thing so that it would be actionable? I guess that's my organizational background. You know, what if people actually had something that they could do something with? So in a few minutes, Ben's going to talk to you about what we propose as a 9th stage of development that we call elder identity revision, and the challenges and specific tasks that go into that stage. So while we're not being Pollyanna about this at all, old age is tough. There's a lot of serious stuff. As Betty Davis said many years ago, old age is not for sissies, right? But if we could help people focus on the things they need to do to manage the challenges that come with old age and all the losses associated with old age, then we might give people an opportunity to really affect a transformation at the end of their lives. So, we're going to talk about the tasks and tools of old age. Our conviction just got stronger and stronger through all of this, that the research demonstrates that one's attitude toward aging is critically important. Elders who are optimistic, active, and driven by purpose live more than 7 years longer on average than those who we might classify as pessimists. And I would like to hear when we get to the discussion part if you see that in your clinical work with your patients. I think we have to deal with what's going on with people and the way they're wired, the genetic complement they've inherited, the challenges that they either are successful at managing during childhood and adulthood, and we also have to deal with our culture. And I would just throw out to you that I think our culture is not very nice to old people. Okay, a lot of ageist stuff in our Western culture, and if you're not familiar with her, some of the best research is by a psychologist at Yale named Becca Levy, who developed a concept called stereotype embodiment theory, SET, S-E-T. It's really about implicit bias. And her research demonstrated, we go through our whole lives from childhood on, and we have negative stereotypes that just keep getting validated over and over again. And then, just to paraphrase what she said in one of her papers, she said, old age is the only in-group that you become a member of if you get old enough. So unlike, race bias or gender bias, here we are living our lives, and suddenly, I don't know, for a few of you it may have happened, but I know for me about a dozen years ago, I probably had been partying too hard the night before and had a few too many adult beverages, and I woke up the next morning a little bleary-eyed. And I wander into the bathroom to try to put myself together, and I'm just startled when I look in the mirror and I see my father. This is a shock. This is when you know that you're in a different in-group now. And as we enter that in-group, all those biases come into play. And so how do we change our perspective about that? So with that background, I think I would just leave you with one thing, and then Ben's going to talk to you about elder identity revision. I think at a global level, we learned several things from talking to these wonderful 52 elders. We learned that even though we were looking for patterns, and we think we found some, we learned that every person really is unique, just over and over again. You know, you inherit your DNA, you have the parents and the caregivers that you have, and they either do well or maybe not so well all the time. And then we face all the challenges of a unique life in the context of where we are and who we are, the relationships that fail, the relationships that succeed. We learned that intentionality is critical in old age. For me, that ultimately translates into goal setting, and if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about goal setting. And finally, I think one of the big learnings is that we interviewed enough elders to know that it's never too late to change. We had people whose lives had totally gone off the rails, but in midlife, they woke up, they worked hard, they looked in the mirror and they said, I don't want the rest of my life to be like this. And they made changes, and they changed the arc of their lives. So with that, Ben, take it away.
So this is something that maybe a few of you have never seen. I'm guessing most of us have. I was lucky enough to take a wonderful introduction to psychology course as a freshman, and fell in love with Erik Erikson. And I thought he captured things in a very broad, inclusive way. He had a fascinating life. Apparently his mother got impregnated out of wedlock, and he was from a Jewish family, but she apparently had gotten impregnated by maybe even a member of the Danish royal family. So Erikson grew up to be a tall, blonde, blue-eyed guy in the Jewish school. So he felt alienated. He felt like he didn't really fit in. And of course, when he left his community and wandered out to the larger German culture, it was virulently anti-Semitic. So he felt like he didn't fit in anywhere. Maybe no surprise that he was the one that coined the phrase identity crisis. He also had profound interest in culture. He dropped out of college and wandered around Europe, experiencing many different cultures. Although he never had a college degree, Anna Freud, of all people, thought he had a certain brilliance and said, hey, how'd you like to be an analyst? None of the rest of us had an easy pass like that, but he went on to become one of the most prominent analysts of the 20th century, a brilliant guy. So the different stages represent different periods in life. Of course, at each period, all issues are in play. But his notion was that there are preeminent issues for each stage. So in infancy, probably something like 0 to 18 months, trust versus mistrust. The children that are raised in homes that are safe and secure, where the infant's needs are met more or less, not perfectly, but good enough, they can begin to feel that the world is a trustworthy place. It deserves your confidence. By contrast, those infants that are abused, neglected, or experiencing a lot of chaos and violence, they feel quite the opposite. The world is a dangerous, untrustworthy place. Now, of course, these attitudes can be changed later if the child's environment significantly changes. But if the caretaking environment remains fairly constant, there's a very good chance that the early foundation laid down in that first stage will carry forward. The next stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, that's the terrible twos. I'm going to just skip on down to the fifth stage, identity versus role confusion. This pertains to adolescence, where of course there are many dramatic changes going on. Physically, intellectually, there's a flowering of formal operations according to Piaget. The social scene changes, the peer groups becomes more and more important. There's a greater ambivalence toward parents. The child, the adolescent, needs to begin to figure out their educational path and what kind of career that interests them at that point. So obviously a great advantage for those people that can have a clear and well-defined identity that's still fluid and in formation, as opposed to those that feel confused heading into early adulthood. So the basic notion about a developmental model like this is that it's sequential, that the success or failure of each stage carries forward to the next. Not that you can't go back and resolve some of the earlier unresolved conflicts, but it gets harder and harder as you go along, and there is certainly a cumulative effect. So let's skip down to the last two stages, generativity versus stagnation. This is the period of late adulthood. Generativity, kind of an odd word, but it alludes to those individuals with a generosity of spirit. We do this as parents, grandparents, as mentors, supervisors, in guiding, in nurturing the next generation. I believe Confucius was given credit for the phrase, planting trees under whose shade you yourself will never sit. So it is not self-serving. It is an investment in the next generation, in the world, even after you are no longer part of it. The alternative to that is stagnation. In Erickson's lovely phraseology, he talks about people that treat themselves and their partners like their own spoiled children. There's more and more focus on hedonism, on instant gratification, and a resistance to investing yourself in the world in a wholehearted way. Often this results in lives that feel somewhat empty and meaningless, and often these individuals develop a variety of psychosomatic complaints as they focus more and more on their bodies. The final stage Erickson talked about was ego integrity. We've changed that because, in my own estimation, self now represents what ego used to in 1950. So self-integrity. This particular developmental task has to do with taking the time to really reflect upon your life, the good, the bad, the ugly. Hopefully fitting the pieces together in a way that makes sense, that makes life seems like it's been meaningful. Of course, there have been mistakes, things that you may be embarrassed about, ashamed about, regret, but in the best of all situations, you're able to forgive yourself and forgive others as well for the ways they've hurt you. I love the Buddhist notion that holding on to anger towards someone is a little like holding hot coals in hopes of having a chance to throw them. You end up hurting yourself more than you hurt anyone else. So this is, despair is the opposite of self-integrity, and it has to do with people that have so many regrets. They feel their life was incomplete or even a failure to one degree or another. They have a bucket list that they'll never be able to attend to, and they don't have enough time to redo things. So a terrible kind of situation. So Erickson proposed this theory, Childhood Society, in 1950. And it's brilliant. As Scott said, we did think, though, that things have changed since then. People live longer, lifespan, and they have health and energy, health span, much longer. On one hand, that sounds great, but there is a thing that psychologists have identified as the paradox of choice, We think we want more choices, more freedom, but actually it's stressful. I heard a business presentation on Trader Joe's. That's part of their business model. They have come to realize that people would rather go into a store that only has 3 brands of ketchup rather than 15. 15 can be a little bit overwhelming. You think, well, I haven't tried that one. But that is the issue we find ourselves in with this span of years ahead of us. After many of us have retired, that was a structure that gave our life a clear direction and meaning and purpose. And raising our kids, something else where there's kind of an inherent structure to things. What are you going to do with all these years? As Scott says, maybe 15 to 20 years. If you look at things like the gray divorce rate, in the last 20 years, the divorce rate of people over 60 has doubled. That's a much higher rate of increase of divorce than for any other age group. People in our age group can move across the country. There are more and more facilities for seniors only. There are pickleball leagues. There are adult education programs. There's all kinds of travel programs. It's almost dizzying and overwhelming. We got a chuckle out of the Villages in Florida. I don't know if you read about that, but the band cranks up at 5 p.m. and closes it down about 9, and they got cheap wine, you know. We have some business cards later. So it's their own little world, but kind of cut off from so much of the rest of reality, for better or for worse. So we thought that there were 5 components to this elder identity revision. Starting at the top there, control. Having a sense that you have lost control is a terrible feeling. It's traumatizing. And this can happen in so many ways, large and small. For one, our bodies. Scott's now struggling with his hearing, especially in noisy restaurants. I'm beginning to lose my vision. I can no longer read out of my left eye. And that's scary. I love to read, and I have just a little keyhole of central vision left. Many of us struggle with arthritis. We've begun to lose strength and energy. It's natural to lose about 0.5% of all your muscle mass every year after age 30. Sarcopenia. And Scott and I joke, ladders can be a treacherous enterprise at our age. So many things that we used to be able to do physically, we can't. Many elders begin to worry about having toileting accidents, little wetting of pants or even soiling of their undergarments out in public. It's scary to feel like you cannot depend on this body that has, for many of us, served us so well over the years. An even greater loss of control comes from losing the people we love. Of course, most of us at this age have lost our parents, but many of us begin to lose spouses and partners. Many of us have lost children, and I have a senior friend, much esteemed, who says that she is losing a good friend about once a month. That's deeply disturbing. At some level, we feel like we want to protect and keep safe the people we love, and to realize you just can't do that in many instances. The next C is competence. Midlife, many of us felt like we were on top of our game. We were good at our jobs. We could handle most things around the house. With our car, we sort of understood how the investment world works. As things have changed in the last few decades, we are overwhelmed by the complexity and confusion of things. Maybe most notably with technology. Many of us sitting down in front of our computer screens cringe if there's an online application we need to fill out, or if we're suddenly told our password needs changing. Our smartphones and smartwatches and smart TVs make us feel pretty stupid. That's distressing. The ability to change a tire, to paint a house, to throw a party for 30. That's something we used to be able to do, most of us, and just can't anymore. At least it's very tough to. The next C is connection. Obviously, relationships are the center of most of our lives. And as we lose people, as we're saying, as we may move ourselves, maybe into a new house, possibly in the same town, but maybe out of state, maybe to be with kids or grandkids. So many of our old connections, our old groups. I had a wonderful lunch group with some old buddies, and one of them died. One of them is staying home taking care of a demented wife, and the other two have cancer. And your social life really begins to thin out. Some of us are better making new friends than old, but there can really feel like some empty spaces in life. And we're going to talk about that a little more in just a bit. The next C is continuity. One of the books, actually it was Bob MD that gave me this book. It was written by Sharon Kaufman, an expansion of her dissertation thesis. It was entitled The Ageless Self. And as Scott says, that confronting the mirror experience, at the very end of the interview, she holds up a mirror in front of the people and say, "What do you see?" And many of us still a little bit horrified when we notice all the wrinkles and blemishes and sagging. Need I say sagging? But we interviewed a 95-year-old woman. She was pretty feisty. And with a twinkle in her eye, she said, "And I'm going for the best smile designation in my new living facility here." Our suspicion was no one else even knew that this was a competition. But this had been her title in her high school yearbook. And she was determined to earn that once again. So I think there's a real wish to hold on to ourselves, especially our best self. But are we really as bright, as well-informed, as stylish, as nimble, as able to walk up the mountains as we were in the past? It gets to be more and more challenging. And especially when people move into a new environment or a new town and you have to establish a circle of friends, will those people come to experience you the way your old friends did, which would be a confirmation of your continuity of identity. The final C is consciousness, and there are three elements to that. First of all, self-consciousness, so your capacity to be self-reflective, self-observing, to really notice when there are changes going on in yourself. I have a 90-year-old friend that says, I realize at this point I need to set one goal per day. More than that, I know I'm going to fail, I know I'm going to get frustrated. So he is brave enough to acknowledge his limitations and to change his plans, his goals, his aspirations and expectations accordingly. Not everyone does that. The second C is spiritual or religious. Some people derive great satisfaction from organized religion. Many others have a more individualized version of spirituality. People our age are well known for their interest in ancestry, maybe genetics, or the history of their ethnic group, or their tribe, or their language. Others get interested in the infinities of time and space in the cosmic consciousness. I think of the poetry of Mary Oliver, who found great meaning in the natural world and obviously felt a powerful sense of connection and participation. Many of us have gone through lives in a narrow way, maybe not really feeling a part of the natural world. That is something some people begin to negotiate. Writing the story of your own life or the life of your family can be a great benefit. Many people go through old photo albums trying to organize things. The final bit of consciousness is existential consciousness. Obviously, this is a developmental task for all of us, how to come to terms with mortality. For some people, thinking about death makes them feel that life was meaningless and empty and ultimately frustrating. Others take a more creative approach and feel that they want to make the most of every day. John Leland, a New York Times reporter, wrote a wonderful book called Happiness is a Choice You Make, which was the punchline of his book. But he followed 6 individuals over 85 years of age, and 5 of the 6 felt that every new day was a gift. something they had no reason to expect or assume, but when it was given to them, it felt like another chance to be alive, to do the things that they enjoy doing. So really a radically different approach.
So before we move on to a case study, I just had to add something to this discussion of EIR. You know, Ben is my spiritual friend and my philosophical friend, and I think at some level I'm just much more pragmatic, and I want a cookbook, you know. So when I look at these 5 C's, I say, okay, if I know that in old age this is the big set of challenges, how do I deal with the losses in each of these areas that are inevitable? It's going to happen, you know. And just as an aside, a few years ago, one of the things we did when we put our sample together was we realized we needed low-income seniors. And we made a connection in the middle of the COVID pandemic with a low-income senior independent living facility in Denver. Some of you may be familiar with it. We thank them in the book. We thank them all the time. Kavod Senior Living down in South Cherry Creek. And they have 400 seniors, most of whom are Medicaid qualified. And they went out of their way to create a virtual environment in one of their conference rooms, solicited volunteers to interview with us, and we did all those interviews virtually with people. And as we came out of COVID, Ben and I offered to do an in-service with their staff that are dealing every day with residents who are falling apart, decompensating, acting out, throwing tantrums, not letting workers into their apartments because they feel, you know, violated. And we suggested to them, well, if you were able to step back as the person charged with making a good intervention here, and you could know whether the person that was acting out was underneath the surface dealing with a loss of control or a feeling of loss of competence, or they'd lost their best friend who just died last week, maybe you could be more empathic with that individual and resolve things more effectively. And we're working with them to figure out whether there are really better ways to work with their residents. So with that, let me turn off the screen. We want to try for the next 5 minutes, maybe 4, if I read fast. We wanted to try to give you a sense of what it was like to sit in a quiet room with somebody for 2 hours and just listen and absorb their life story. So let me read a little bit about a woman named Judy, who I couldn't help it. She was one of my favorites. But I think you'll like Judy. Judy met us at the door of her small home and welcomed us in. She's a trim woman in her late 70s with short gray hair, and she moves energetically. Her lively eyes and friendly smile convey vitality, and she immediately made us feel at ease. She had carefully read the materials we'd sent in advance, understood the nature of the interview, and with minimal prompting, she launched into her life story in a thoughtful and very organized way. She'd given us some thought. She'd grown up on a small farm and vividly described the pleasures and joys of her childhood, the animals and the verdant rolling landscape. After a bit of significant hesitation, though, she revealed some of the trials and traumas of her youth. Her father's multiple affairs, her mother's deepening depression and subsequent withdrawal, and then her physical abuse by a farmhand. Although she had been a bright, promising student, Judy's troubled life began to manifest as rebellious and defiant behaviors, and her grades suffered. Her parents became increasingly disturbed about her behavioral problems, so they packed her off to a boarding school. Solved that problem, right? But nothing changed. She continued to break the rules and was indifferent about academics. She went to college and dropped out after a year. As a young adult, she developed a serious alcohol problem and worked at one low-level clerical job after another. Her personal life was a shambles as she married and divorced 3 times in quick succession. She had 3 daughters from her first marriage, but her alcoholism progressed to the point where she had to relinquish care to the father. Over time, as she struggled and failed repeatedly in her efforts to sober up, and the abandonment of her children loomed as painfully shameful for her. At work, however, she harnessed her native intelligence to become a successful manager at a technology firm. And as an aside, I would tell you that we saw this quite often. People who are able to hold themselves together and look quite normal out there in their careers and with their coworkers, while their personal life, was crap. But Judy is also one of those people who turned things around. And in late middle age, she met Bill at a 12-step program. Although he was 13 years older and neither of them had ever figured out how to have a stable, intimate relationship, they crafted a workable partnership. Although there were flare-ups, they remained committed to each other and to their alcohol-free lifestyle. They had 20 good years together before Bill died of cancer 10 years ago. Most important, she has been able to face up to the haunting shame of her life, the abandonment of her daughters. It was a difficult, slow, and tearful process, but Judy reached out to her children, apologized, and successfully reconnected with them. They're now reconciled and working hard to make up for lost time. During our interview, we were repeatedly amazed by Judy's courage and honesty. She told her story straight with a minimum of defensive avoidance or rationalization. In fact, at times it was nakedly confessional. And when we pointed this out to her, she told us she had decided to challenge herself to be as candid as possible with us. In retrospect, we realized that she had been striving in the interview to live up to the principles of her 12-step program. Humility, unflinching honesty, spiritual integrity, willingness to conduct a searching moral inventory, and to admit her mistakes. Well, I suspect that's sort of the life review thing in a nutshell, right? So we walked away from the interview profoundly impressed. Judy's life story includes the good, the bad, and the ugly, but she's honestly faced up to it all and woven it into a complex, cohesive, and compelling narrative. This has provided the foundation for a strong and flexible elder identity. She exemplifies resilience and gratitude, and we're going to talk about some of these specific characteristics in a minute. And she's worked hard to build an active and purposeful lifestyle. She reads the New York Times every day, keeps up with politics, maybe not for the last week, and world events, takes daily walks, and has become energetically engaged with friends, volunteer organizations, and her local church. We had the opportunity to re-interview her recently. She continues to keep on keeping on. She's moved back and forth across the country, went to where she thought it would be easier, to a country called Florida. Then she realized that she missed her friends, and she went back to where we interviewed her originally, which has some pretty cold, tough winters, but she needed the connection. She continues, in spite of increasing physical difficulties with arthritis and with balance. She's humble enough, though, to routinely use a cane, and can even joke about it, saying the cane would come in handy when faced with threatening dogs or unscrupulous politicians. So, we heard 52 marvelous stories, and as you get to know people, we had a compressed 2-hour time, and it was really something. So Ben has outlined the challenges, the tasks of elderhood. Let's go back and look at the skills we think came out of our research. I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics, but not that much after Ben finishes. Whoop. There you go, Ben.
So we're into alliteration, tasks, and tools. So these are the tools, and we also call them healthy habits. So the acronym GRASP, G for gratitude, R for resilience, A for active practices, S for self-acceptance, and P for purpose. I'm going to change the order of those a little bit because I like to envision how these come into play on a typical day.
Time.
So gratitude, such a critical thing. I'm told that the Orthodox Jews have a prayer they say every morning when they wake up. Maya Angelou had her own version of this. She felt grateful for each day and said to herself, I am glad that this sheet did not become my winding sheet, this bed not my cooling bed. Gratitude is something that you actually can cultivate. There have been a number of research studies looking at, for instance, gratitude journaling with college students who were instructed to think of 3 things each evening they were grateful for. It actually showed rather remarkable results. Not only did they feel better, overall sense of well-being, but their blood pressure was lower, they had fewer physical complaints, they exercised more, and had a more helpful attitude toward others. This could be part of a larger approach to cultivate joy. Dasher Keltner at University of California, Berkeley has written a book called Awe, A-W-E, encouraging people to notice things about them that might indeed inspire awe. It could be natural beauty, or artistic, musical, architectural, or moral beauty in individuals. But it does seem like there are people that have kind of cut themselves off from that. They just are not good at it, and other people seem to practice it. Judith Moskowitz at Northwestern University had an entire program, and she suggested the following. Notice when something gives you joy or happiness. Remember it and maybe tell someone about it. 2, if you think of someone you're grateful for, someone who's done you a favor or been important to you, make sure you tell them that, and maybe even write them a letter. Benefit finding. Even in the most difficult circumstances, often at times there's something positive. Try to think about what that might be, even if it just means you proved to yourself you were strong enough to endure it. Finally, practice random acts of kindness. There was a study done in a coffee shop. Half the group was asked to just go through the usual motions. The other half was asked to actually just take a moment and say hello to the barista, ask their name, ask how their day was going. And when these people were interviewed later, the people that had made that effort to reach out to the barista felt good about themselves, about the experience, and actually that good feeling lingered for days. So the next, purpose. So you woke up and you do feel some sense of gratitude. But what gets you out of bed? What are your plans? What are your intentions for the day? Do you have a sense of purpose? We were really impressed by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was an Austrian psychiatrist who spent 3 years in a Nazi concentration camp. It was his conclusion that people did not survive if their only goal was just to survive. They needed to have another reason than that. And the most compelling reason for many of them was that there was someone that needed their help. Scott's father-in-law, also a Holocaust survivor, was determined to survive the camp so he could get out and find his 2 sisters, wherever they might be across the world, and help take care of them. Frankl also noticed that some people had a purpose that had to do with making the world a better place. There was a scientist who'd done a lot of research, but not gotten around to writing his books before he was picked up by the Nazis. He was determined to survive so he could write those books. And in fact, he did. Emily Esfahani Smith wrote a wonderful book. We have a whole list of suggested readings in our book. Her book was The Power of Meaning. And she talked about how our world is obsessed with happiness, but really the way to happiness from her research is through purpose. And she talked about the other purposes that sustain people, continuing to be determined to be your best self, to maintain your integrity. This is something that the Greek Stoics talked a lot about. They even said, shame on you if external circumstances change your attitude toward the life, toward your life or your circumstances. So, and then the final one she talks about again was religion and spirituality. There's also quite a literature that sprung up about post-traumatic growth. George Bonanno, a professor at the Teachers College at Columbia University, did a number of studies looking at mass disasters, things like hurricanes and floods, 9/11, and his estimation was that about 1/3 of people are prone to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But 2/3, if you press them a little bit, you find out that they did some benefit finding and that there was some post-traumatic growth that ensued from their exposure to this trauma. Also, Lucy Hone has a wonderful TED Talk, The 3 Secrets of Resilient People. Number 1, don't feel sorry for yourself, because we all have traumas, especially at our age. Number 2, be clear in your own mind what you have control over. So it's like the serenity prayer. Accept what you cannot control with serenity, have the courage to change what you can change, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And the final secret, as she proposes it, was whatever you're doing, ask yourself, is it working? She and her husband were invited to go to the trial where the drunk driver who had killed her daughter was to be tried and sentenced. And they asked themselves, but will this help? And they decided they'd go to the beach instead. And they felt like that was a good decision. So, gratitude, purpose, resilience. In the middle of your day, you might think about active practices. And there are 3 major dimensions to that. Number 1, social. How involved are you with other people? And you can think of that as like a concentric circle. The inner circle is your family, your closest friends. The next circle out would be more casual friends. And the circle beyond that is a community. Susan Pinker, a Canadian psychologist, wrote a book called The Village Effect. And she looked at how important it is for people to feel part of a larger community. She looked at some islands, for instance, and how interconnected the people's lives were. And many of them, it was one of those blue zones where people there were an inordinate number of them that lived past 100. We joke in our book about the old Cheers sitcom, where every time Norm came through the door, everyone roared out his name. And wouldn't that be wonderful to be a part of a group like that? Next, in terms of active practices, is physical. Very important to keep exercising. The World Health Organization recommends 10,000 steps a day. Some people would say 15,000 is even greater. There are other dimensions besides cardiovascular fitness, which is the most important. And in fact, moderate physical exercise actually helps to recruit stem cells in your hippocampus to create new neurons, which improves memory. But in addition to cardiovascular training, it's important to do some weight training. Again, we do lose muscle mass over time, especially if we're not doing some resistance training. Number 3, balance, very important. There are balance pads. You can practice standing on one foot. Even if you don't have them, you can just practice left foot when you're brushing your upper teeth, right foot when you're brushing your lower teeth. But balance is critically important. A broken hip for an elder results in 1/6 to 1/3 of those individuals dying within a year. You do not want to fall and break your hip. And the final step is flexibility. And there are a number of very nice apps out there to help you exercise and flex both upper and lower body. The final dimension of this is your intellectual active practices. Important to keep your brain active. You need to read, and read demanding material, not simple stuff. Not People magazine, not the Denver Post, which apparently is pegged at about a 6th grade reading level. You need to take on material that has challenging vocabulary, challenging concepts, so you're really stressing your brain. When you talk with people, if you're talking with a child, that's pretty good brain stimulation. If you talk with someone with a different political or philosophic orientation, That's going to be challenging. Just talking to someone who agrees with everything you say, you don't get much for that. There are things like crossword puzzles and Sudoku and Wordle. There are also probably some scams out there. Luminosity was being heavily advertised a number of years ago on NPR until it was found that actually did not seem to increase brain functioning at all. But there are some programs put out by actual neuroscientists. Things like Brain HQ and Posit Science are two that have been highly recommended. You also need to keep up with your medical care. If you look at the big 5 personality traits, the one that is most highly correlated with longevity, conscientiousness. So you need to go to your doctor's appointments, keep up with your tests, whether that be colonoscopies or mammograms or EKGs. You need to take your pills, very mundane and prosaic, but it does make a difference over time. So finally, the last of the healthy habits is self-acceptance. This has a lot to do with self-integrity. Scott talked about the life review. There's a wonderful program out there. We don't get any money for this, called Storyworth. They send you a journaling prompt every day. You write once a week. You write about it, mail it in. At the end of the 52 weeks, they pull it all together. They've created a book for you. It's a nice way to write your autobiography with a little help, external help. So critical, as Scott has said, to be able to be honest with yourself the entire life you've lived, to have a sense of forgiveness toward yourself and others, to feel like there's some coming together of your life in a way that makes it feel meaningful.
So to briefly recapitulate, because you're just lucky you didn't hear the long version of that. So, look, we listen to these wonderful life stories, sometimes not so wonderful. We push them on occasion. We ask clarifying questions. We ask them to dig a little deeper and explain in more depth what was going on at that point in their life. And we collected enough data so that after each interview, Ben and I went off by ourselves and scored people on 29 dependent variables and 1 independent global aging wisely score. We used a 5-point Likert scale. So we had about 1,500 plus data points. We knew we couldn't do this ourselves. We found a wonderful graduate student over at the medical school here, and he came back all excited. He said, look at this heat map. Now, after we break up, some of you statistics nerds can come explain to me. All I know is that these are our 30 variables, and that the redder the map is, the more correlation across those factors there is. What makes more sense to me is that when we looked at our variables, and when you know that a correlation factor of 0.5 is pretty good, pretty strong correlation. A 0.7 correlation is stronger yet. Anything over 0.8 is a really strong correlation. And what you see up here are a lot of the factors we just talked about. They just popped out. So we've got four of our 5 GRASP tools. We've got gratitude, we've got resilience, we've got purpose, we've got self-acceptance, we've got Erickson's self-integrity up here with the highest correlation at 0.92. What's important to me is that if you're one of those competitive people and you're getting to old age and you're saying, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed, I have to be great at all of these things. No, you don't. You know, because if you're good at 3 of these over 0.8 correlation factors, you account for over 98% of the variability in the data. So you don't have to be good at everything, but you have to be good enough at some of these things that I think of as competencies, old age competencies. It can make a significant difference. So with that, I think we want to say thank you. We want to open it up for some questions. Any comments, thoughts? What do you think of our journey? Thank you.
I want to answer your question of what do I think of your journey. I just want to highlight the beauty of your relationship. I've been reading a lot about male development and how unusual and unique it is that the both of you have sustained and maintained this relationship, and you exemplify all of the variables that you wrote about. So thank you.
Well, thank you. My relationship with Ben is the longest relationship in my whole life. So, he can try to get away, but it's not going to happen.
I want to comment also on
Should we
the
use the
process.
microphone?
Do I need that? Okay.
Yes.
Hello? Yeah. I want to comment on the generosity of your effort to interview people and how much of yourself you gave by just sitting and listening. You must have been aware of the good you were doing in the process, no matter what their story was, how they were coping at that stage. And I think it's just such a generous gift to us to have categorized things in a phenomenological way. There's a name for the study, a phenomenological study from grad school. That's one of the ways we earn their doctorates. And
Hold the mic closer.
Hold it closer. Well, I just want to end by saying I'm grateful to you both and feel very proud for you.
Thank you so much.
We've put in thousands of hours at this, but all I can tell you that this has given me much more than I've given it. And I think that's when you do something altruistically. I mean, we weren't trying to make money at this. I was waiting for Oprah to call for a long time, but it never happened. So I've given up on that one.
It was a New York analyst that came through a number of years ago. I should remember his name, but I can't right this moment. He said, just listening to another person, patiently, receptively, is experienced as love. And boy, I think that is so true. And in fact, we wondered whether we could begin to recommend people do this for each other. But, I do think that would be underestimating, in a way, the skill that probably just about everyone in this room has acquired. And that is how to listen patiently, sensitively, without inserting your own agendas, your own needs into the conversation. And, that's something that many of us have worked years and years to try to refine.
Thank you. That was a beautiful presentation. And I agree with the woman who was saying that one of the things that I noticed is that about time is that you've had time to develop this relationship, and I was curious about how it's evolved over time, especially because you didn't set out to do a project together, but it sort of evolved as a creative potential from your relationship and deepening it.
You hear stories about, like people, songwriter, lyricist partnerships, and they do Broadway plays and things like that. I will tell you that from my standpoint, we experienced both the best of all worlds and the worst of all worlds. It was at times terrible arguing about writing style and where the priorities were.
Don't even bring up semicolons.
Yeah. So, even though Ben loves compound sentences.
Oh, here it comes.
I can say that I genuinely love the man, and he accepts some of my editing suggestions on occasion, so that helps too. Do you want to add to that?
heard an interview recently with Danny Kahneman and talked about his long-term partnership with, was it Dvorsky? Tversky. And the interviewer says, so what happened with you guys? He said, well, we got along for 6-7 years. That's pretty good. But it's been a great delight. At our 40th year of our relationship, Scott says, because, you know, I'd rather just keep working. Scott says, hey, let's go to the Keys and do some scuba diving. And we did. So we struck a nice balance there.
Listen, thank all of you. We'll hang around for a while.
There's a question.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, I noticed on the scale that there was healthy grieving.
There was what?
Healthy grieving.
Ah, yes.
Seemed to be above the 8 points, but I didn't hear you speak about it, and I was curious what you wanted to say.
Very sharp-eyed. In fact, I think that was our second highest correlation of all. And, you know, I have a great interest in attachment theory, and the 3 variables that most closely correspond to attachment theory is, number 1, connection, which is like about a 0.86, and healthy grieving, and having a reliable attachment figure, which is one of Valiant's protective factors. So you're exactly right. And, you know, it's a paradox to a lot of people, but the people that love the most also grieve the most, but they also move through that grieving process and go on to have a life. My wife and I, Carol, we lost our youngest daughter and 11 years ago, and we've been part of that Compassionate Friends group ever since. And every month we see new parents and siblings come in and remember how devastating that was. But it's been fascinating to watch how each of us finds our own path as we move through that. But you're exactly right. So it's somewhat paradoxical, but once you look at it more deeply, it makes sense that those that have the capacity for love also grieve deeply, but then find a way to move beyond it. I do want to say we do have some books if you would like to pick one up on the way. We also have business cards if you just want to think about it and go home. You can find our book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Some of the local bookstores may begin to stock it. It's actually a mysterious process how that works, so I can't tell you who's doing it. We're going to have a book signing, Barnes & Noble, South Collar Boulevard, in late May, and also the Boulder Bookstore. But between now and then, I have no idea what's going to happen. We also have a free monthly newsletter. We just wrote one on hormesis and the golden mean. Anyway, it's free, but if you'd like to be put on our mailing list for that, please put your name and email or give us a business card, and we'll add you to the list.
I'd just like to, perhaps I missed it, but what were you correlating these variables with?
We're correlating these against a global aging wisely
Got it.
score.
And again, our ultimate sense was that it was our gut level intuitive feeling about the individuals that was really going to be most accurate and most valid. And so that's why we put such stock into that, in that score.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any follow-up with these people you interviewed?
We've had second interviews with about a quarter of our 52 elders. You know, I would tell you that probably 6 or 8 of them have passed away since their first interview. But in terms of follow-up, in terms of more research, we'd like to encourage other people to pick up the gauntlet. I think our society has not done a good job of how to support elderly people. You know, one of the things that came out of this project for me was because of our the wonderful relationship we developed with Kavod Senior Living, they asked me to join their board. And so that's sort of my nonprofit volunteer activity. And we're searching for ways to increase our range of services to people who are out there living in their homes trying to age in place, because nursing homes are closing their doors every day because they just can't pay for it.
Scott's very modest. He actually now is the chairman of the board. So I actually have to salute him every time we meet. But no, I'm really so proud of the work he's doing over there. It's really a remarkable facility. I think they really exemplify best practices for that kind of residential program for that population in particular. We've really started doing a number of presentations around, including some of these independent and assisted living facilities, and we sort of feel like Johnny Appleseed. You know, we're probably going to still lose money on the publishing of the books, but you know, we really enjoy getting the word out there. So, and tonight's a big part of that.
But you know, there's never an easy answer. It's like, I'm trying to age in place, but I also know that there's a huge risk of getting isolated and losing connection with people. And in some of these really nice culture, independent living facilities, you see people interacting with each other all day long, sharing their skills and experiences, training each other in subjects that they love. It's quite nice.
Yep, thank you both very much. I also want to ask, I've had a lot of people over the years have talked about a visibility and invisibility factor for themselves on various levels, right, with losses and changes. Do you think you'd sort of put that under purpose? I mean, where do you think you'd fit that into your thinking?
Well, part of it, you know, is the social, is the relationship. It's like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man.
Yeah.
If you walk down the street, no one even sees you or sort of recognizes your presence. I mean, that's a fundamental devaluation and dehumanization. So I guess I put it more in the relational realm.
You know, I mean, I think I can validate what you're saying. I mean, I think it has to do with purpose and connection. I know my wife and some of her friends sit around and talk about how, well, you know, people used to actually turn when they walked into a restaurant and look at them, but you reach a certain age and nobody looks anymore. Well, that happens to guys too, although we're sort of embarrassed to talk about it, you know. We're sort of invisible unless we're doing something erratic, right?
I was wondering if your results, as you presented them tonight, give the feeling to you that as we age, we become more homogenous in a way, just human. Or if, and maybe this is for some other researchers, if you did find there were distinct differences for men, for women, different classes, different races, or not.
I remember, I think, my mom saying, you know, after a certain age, you have the face you deserve. But I think it's even more true about personalities. And it's a great question. I hadn't thought about that, but I think if anything, people become more different and more distinct. We've interviewed some people that light up the room when they walk into it. And, you know, people in their late 70s and 80s, just remarkable people. And you just, one of the things we talk about is Laura Carstensen. She was a kind of a wild kid, didn't want to go to college even though her father was a university professor. She got in a terrible car accident and almost died. Ended up in a long-term rehab facility where there were a lot of elders. And she said, oh my God, and here I'm around all these old women. And she assumed they were all going to be alike. But the more she got to know them, the more she really realized how distinctly individual each of them was. And she really came to value them greatly. She went back to school and ultimately went on to Stanford, where she developed the Stanford School for Stanford Institute for Longevity, I think is what it's called, and really has written some remarkable pieces about that. So I guess on the whole, I would think we actually become more distinct as our personalities play out over time.
I would tell you that, at least at these sort of high-level issues around elder identity revision and these 5 healthy habits and self-integrity, and we didn't detect any differences ethnically, racially, age-wise. I think we did find surprising to the 2 of us who are not particularly religiously observant that people who have strong faith seem to face old age with a whole lot more equanimity than some of the rest of us. Now, I don't know whether they're right or wrong, but they knew what their job was, they played their role, they know what's going to happen when they die, and it's all good, right?
Although even there are nuances, because one of the fellows that was the most religious had been a devout Catholic his entire life. He tried to convert us at least 3 or 4 times during the interview. And by the end, I think he shook his head, feeling like we were doomed to eternity in Hades. So it was kind of a rigidity there that did not play well over time.
I have a question. So I'm thinking as you guys are discussing your participants being in nursing homes, the change from collectivistic cultures where parents are living with their kids, do you find that now in this individualistic culture, the identity revision being more prominent because they're forced to kind of separate that enmeshment that was once with their children? Now they're forced to really reflect on their own identity away from their children, away from their spouses eventually. How does that come?
It's a great question, and we did talk about this in the book. We looked at the statistics, for instance, the number of Americans over 70 who are living alone is about 2 or 3 times what it is in most developed countries. So I think and that's part of, again, Vivek Murthy's notion about isolation and loneliness being a terrible mental health problem for our entire country. But I think especially for elders who are separate from their families, I think it's a huge burden and a major obstacle.
I would also just add that I think for a variety of economic reasons, we're seeing more instances of multi-generation families living under the same roof. I know among my friends and peers, we may not have done a great job with our kids, but we are ready to babysit, those grandchildren, because they're just delightful, and that becomes a priority. So I think we're finding ways to improve the connectedness. I hope you all feel like we have an optimistic perspective. Old age is a challenge just like any other stage of life. And, as one of my last conversations with my father-in-law, he passed away just a couple weeks before his 99th birthday. And he looked at me one morning. I think he could talk to me easier than he could talk to his kids. And he looked at me and he said, "I have to ask you this. Am I going to get out of this thing alive?" and we laughed and we talked. No, you're not, but it's okay.
Let me throw one more thing at you if you hadn't already had too much. One of the things we talk about in the conclusion of her book is the work by Alicia Crum. She's a Stanford University psychologist, and she's looked at the issue of mindset. How you approach a stress makes a huge difference. It almost seems hard to believe, but she has solid data. They worked with a group of housekeepers in a major hotel, and they took half the group and explained to them that whether they realized it or not, the work they were doing, the exercise they were doing, met the criteria for healthy exercising according to the World Health Organization. And they checked back with them in a month or two. Only that group, not the control group, actually showed significant improvements in their physical health. Some of them had lost weight, their blood pressure was better, just because they suddenly thought that this thing they've been doing all along was good exercise. Who knew? There are two attitudes she talks about. The stress is debilitating mindset. It just wears you down. It's going to beat you up. And you can think about that being an attitude toward aging. Or stress is enhancing. If you see it as a challenge that you can take on, it's not bigger than you. And that if you really fight with it, there can be some good outcomes. So it's interesting how much power our minds do have even over our bodies in this way.
We'll just do one more question, Roy, and then we'll break.
Yeah, I have a question. Yesterday I was having lunch with my son. We were talking about going to a really nice place to observe the next eclipse or an eclipse. And we were talking about the dates that were coming up. And we were getting into the mid-2030s, and I said, it brought up an issue that I imagine has come up in your interviews. How do people appreciate and deal with the finiteness of their lives, the fact that they aren't going to get out of life?
You know, again, Laura Carstensen has some wonderful theories. She needed a marketing person because she called it the socio-emotional selectivity theory. Kind of just rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? But it basically has to do with your perception of your time horizon. And she found that that had a profound effect on people. So for instance, if you ask a young person whether they would like to go out to lunch with their old friends or potentially have lunch with a semi-famous author, a young person would say, hey, I'll go out to lunch with the author. That might be really fun, might be exciting, might discover something. Older person say, I don't have time to waste. I'm going with my old friends. And the same effect was evident with younger people. For instance, people who are dying of AIDS, they also had this sense of a proximal time horizon, and they wanted to make the most of being with people they knew, going to favorite restaurants, eating the same food they knew they loved. They didn't want to take a chance on wasting it. And the same thing for Chinese as in Hong Kong as they're about to be absorbed by mainland China. So anytime you think that your time is limited, it really does change your perspective in a profound way.
And sort of on another tack, I would tell you that of the people we interviewed, I don't think we had a single person who said that they were fearful of death. You know, they might not want to, they might not want to be in pain when leading up to death, but I don't think anybody said they were afraid of dying. It was like, this is the way life is.
You're exactly right. That was a major surprise for me too. One of our wisest women said, death for me is a constant companion. There with me, but it's as though she'd made her peace with that. And she was someone who had lived a very rich, full life in spite of a lot of difficulties. And I think she was feeling like, this has been deeply satisfying. And, the more the better, but, this has been a pretty terrific ride so far.
So we're glad you're all on the path with us. Let's do this good.